I want to introduce Suzanne Adili, who is a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. She is the president-elect of the National Lawyers Guild, a longtime Arab community organizer, a member of Al-Auda New York, and the co-director of a Binational Food Workers Alliance. Welcome, Suzanne, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Charlotte. I just wanted to spend a brief time welcoming everybody to this webinar. I'm very excited to listen to this amazing group of panelists and to participate in such an important discussion on the legacies of colonialism and resistance and what we can learn from them. And I particularly want to welcome you on behalf of the National Lawyers Guild and its international committee, as well as its national office, and on behalf of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with those organizations, but we are committed to using legal tools to support liberation struggles and to support a growing and necessary movement, anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. If you'd like to learn more about those two organizations, the NLG and IDL, we'll be happy to share links to our websites in the chat. And before I introduce her, I would just like to thank Lamise for her hard work in putting this webinar together. Lamise Deek is a Palestinian-born, New York-based human rights attorney who has handled a wide range of criminal, administrative, and civil cases related to Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim rights, including defense against terrorism charges, repressive and violent state and federal policing, and Zionist efforts to shut down mosques, defending protesters of several communities, and defending Palestinians and allies against Israeli lawfare-based attacks. Lamise is also an activist and community organizer, a longtime member of the National Lawyers Guild, a member and co-founder of Al-Auda, and a member of many other Palestinian organizations. Lamise, I'll let you take over now.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Charlotte. Suzanne, I don't know if you properly introduced yourself. It was really an honor to have this event hosted by the National Lawyers Guild and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Both Charlotte and Suzanne are members of the Bureau of International Association of Democratic Lawyers, IADL, and Suzanne is the president-elect of the National Lawyers Guild. And so their adoption of this event and their hard work on this is really critical for a number of reasons. And I think it reinforces the commitment of activist attorneys globally. And I think, as a number of the panelists will address, this is becoming increasingly important across the world. The militarization, amenization of the law and lawyering and the judicial system in repressing and liquidating national liberation movements. And so our ability to coordinate is kind of detailed, critical, and I thank you. And though, despite the fact that all of our panelists are men today, it was the women that you've heard from so far who are the genesis and part of putting this together and making it happen. The panelists are quite a brilliant team of friends and comrades and brothers who practice what they preach in all ways. And so it's an honor to be here today on what marks the 66th anniversary of the beginning of the Algerian Revolution and the 133rd anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. And one can't help but wonder what would have been the trajectory of the Algerian full liberation struggle, but for the maintenance of a European American colonial outpost in Palestine. And I think it's understanding the relationships between these dynamics in the region and globally that will help us really be able to figure out what become the next key or most pivotal steps. Of course, when we're talking about Algeria and South Africa, we're talking about nations that have passed the full anti-colonial liberation stage. And when we're talking about Palestine, we're talking about a nation that not only didn't manage to reach anti-colonial or decolonized liberation, but weren't able to really capture the momentum of resistance, the revolutionary momentum to bring us towards full decolonization and liberation, but rather went to the phase of reform, which is the phase from which people in South Africa and Algeria and, of course, Palestine struggle for, and which can probably be accurately and fairly described as neoliberal, state-centered reform, as what primarily ails those two nations and as a driving force of colonization and Zionist expansion in Palestine. I'd also be remiss to not mention there are quite a number of notable, brilliant attendees who registered for the Zoom, and it would just be too much to introduce and recognize everybody. And I also recognize, and the panelists know, that this is a rather advanced kind of grouping. Our questions and the panel will attempt to kind of lead us to a tangible work product that becomes usable. And part of the way that we'll be doing that is through your directed questions. And when I say your, I'm referring only to the Zoom registrants. We won't be kind of synthesizing and compiling questions from people who are watching live or on YouTube or elsewhere. So it's a lot of moving parts, and we'll do our best, and forgive us in advance for anything that we missed. And like Charlotte and Suzanne noted, there'll be a synthesis that's sent after the fact. On that note, it's my deep pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker from Algeria by way of New York, Brahim Rouabi, who's an Algerian political activist, organizer, and academic. He's the co-founder of the UK-based Algeria Solidarity Campaign and the US-based Algeria Revolt Collective. He's currently working on his PhD in political science at the City University of New York Graduate Center and a teaching fellow in political science at Brooklyn College. Before I start off with you, Brahim, I'm sure all the attendees know, but I'd like to also we'll have Brahim go first, Naim Gina from South Africa second, followed by Tawfiq Haddad, who comes to us from Greece, but is based in Palestine and grew up in the US. And our extreme honor and delight to also have Ubay Aboudi, who was recently released from a recently released Palestinian political prisoner, who'll be closing us out, and then we'll go into the question segment. On that note, Brahim, will you lead us off? Thank you.
Thank you, Lamis. And first of all, I would like to thank the NLG, the National Lawyers Guild, and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers for putting this webinar together. All, as Lamis just pointed out, the legwork that went into making this possible is all due to the amazing women who are and revolutionaries who rarely actually put themselves forward, but they actually do the actual work that needs to be done. So I bow to you all for with respect. And so what I'm gonna do, given today, as was mentioned, marks the 66th anniversary of the start of the Algerian liberation movement or a struggle that really brought to an end the French Empire, and a 7 years long struggle that resulted in 1.5 million martyrs, 6 million displaced. That's in a population of 8 million people. But given the format of today's event, it goes without saying that it's impossible to cover everything. So I think I'm going to restrict myself to making like really 3 or 4 theoretical points, and then maybe if I have enough time, maybe I can go ahead and provide a brief historical overview of the of Algeria, or a counter historical overview than the mainstream that we usually hear. And I leave any questions, the coverage of the current movement, ongoing revolutionary movement in Algeria, to the Q&A session. So the first point I would like to make is that I've been trying to think about this category of post-colonial and what it does analytically, the work it does analytically, but also what it produces politically. I think, it's obviously something that I'm still thinking about, but it seems to me that when we think of the post-colonial, the assumption is that, our approach, the underlying assumption or premise that we depart from is that history moves in ruptures and discontinuities and breaks, that there is the colonial and then the post-colonial, and once you put yourself in that sort of space, post-colonial space, then you're obviously preventing yourself from seeing the colonial, the continuation of the colonial in the post-colonial, or the coloniality of the post-colonial. So. Something that I suggest is that we think, how about instead of thinking of the post-colonial, thinking about it in continued decolonization process, and also a colonial counter-revolution, that colonial powers don't just drag their tales of defeat and leave, but they would they would fight tooth and nail to at least maintain the advantages that they had, or in the worst case scenario, limit the damages to sort of the gains that they had made, in some cases over centuries of colonization. So thinking about the counter-revolution, I think the colonial counter-revolution opens up for us ways or horizons to think about these processes that we usually hear about, talking about neoliberalism, talking about, we need to think about them as part and parcel of this much longer process, much longer struggle. For liberation and emancipation. The post-World War II, I think the decolonization movement in the mid-20th century really was a world-altering process, where you have people across the global south, the colonized world, rising up to dismantle the structures of oppression that had been erected over the previous centuries, and with that, with the sort of the retreat of the French and the British Empire, the baton was passed in some ways to the United States. And I think the American empire ought to be seen as the leader, if you like, of this colonial counter-revolution. And so the idea behind it is to maintain those infrastructures that were built over centuries by the French, by the British, and use them as a springboard from which to build, to engage in empire building. So on the material level, there is the maintenance of those infrastructures, and it's a whole portfolio. There are institutional infrastructures such as the Commonwealth and the France Afrique and so on, but also discursive, symbolic, and so on and so forth. So that on the material level, you have that, and on the ideational, symbolic level, there had to be the sort of target of the counter-revolution is to break this third worldist, tricontinental, Pan-Africanist, Afro-Asian, Muslim internationalist solidarities, because these are the superstructure, ideological superstructures of of anti-colonialism, and these had to be attacked. They had to come under attack constantly, and they had to be at least discredited. Of course, I'm not going to talk much about Palestine because there are more people here who know a lot more about that. But I want to say one thing. I think the decolonization of Palestine became the litmus test for the counter-revolution, because it had held this. It became sort of it symbolized the post-colonial third worldist consensus. And if you get, from the counter-revolution's point of view, if you get people to normalize, to think that it's okay for a settler colonial colony to still exist, then they have already lost. So the symbolism of Palestine is key. And the more they get states and so on to normalize with it, the more that's sort of how they measure the success of the counter-revolution. And that happened post Camp David for a little bit. Obviously, the Oslo Accords flung open the gates of even further, and so on. So, but I'm sure my Palestinian comrades can tell us more about that kind of process. Now, something else that I want to say, that's the second point about sort of dismantling the symbolic sort of superstructure. The third point I want to make is because Algeria, what for example Algeria has in common with Palestine and South Africa, they were /are all settler colonies. And Algeria, in some ways, is seen as a successful case of decolonization, right? But the problem is the coloniality of power. Once you liberate the land, right? Because there is the liberation of the land, but that's not enough on its own without the emancipation of the people. And without that, it will forever be an incomplete process. Now, in what is usually referred to as post-colonial states or these post-colonial elites, the problem is not only they just take over the institutions that are left by the colonizer, and you just sort of exchange settlers with people who look like you to operate the same systems. But the key, like the heart of the coloniality of power is the lack of belief in the people. That there is this idea that there is always a leader who's somehow illuminated, who knows better than the people. And the people can, they cannot sort of self-determine. And that's precisely the attitude, the condescending attitude of the colonizer, that these colonized are just barbaric, they can't rule themselves, they can't decide for themselves, hence the need for colonial administration. So for as long as you have people in power in sort of the former colonized world who sort of don't believe in their own people, then you really still have a colonial situation just with the native face. Different people have discussed, talked or hinted at that in different ways. From Fanon, who talks about sort of national bourgeoisies, to Nkrumah, who talks about neo-colonialism. So they've all touched on the subject from different sort of points of view and from different standpoints. The last point I want to make, a theoretical point I want to make, is the global governance over the last 60 years, 70 years. There is an attitude of a global governance has been sort of based on blackmail. In some ways, talking about imperialism, it really does it a favor, because that's sort of a respectful language. You know, these are mob-like, thuggish ways of governing the world, and that needs to be said. Blackmailing, you know, getting minority groups, right? Be their sort of form of solidarity as you know, emanating from class or racial or ethnic or you know what have you, plundering the resources of their own people, and being sort of conveyor belts for northbound wealth transfers, and in some case slaughtering their own people, as is the case in Algeria in the 90s. That makes it easier to blackmail you as a ruler, right? Hold the ICC over your head, you know, as in the case of al-Bashir or what, you know how international, we have lawyers here, international lawyers who can tell us about the politics of international law and how international criminal law is weaponized in these cases so in the same, you know, I know there are people with us from the US and who watch a lot more sort of cinema, but you know the figure of the corrupt policeman who rejoices at having some proof and evidence over the head of a mafia, right? Because that makes it easier for them to handle them, right? They can get them to do whatever they want, you know, while holding sort of that evidence or the potential of imprisoning them over their heads. That's the same case for a global policeman to hold those, you know, to blackmail corrupt elites who are plundering, you know, their countries and approaching them in connection to the last, the previous point. Also, the coloniality of power is not just ideational in terms of how you see your people, but also seeing your country, the home country, as sort of a space of extraction. That their investments are always in the metropoles. Their ill-gotten fortunes are in northern banks, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a form that is an ideational, but also a material dimension to it, and they go hand in hand. One accompanies the other. I think I don't want to sort of monopolize I think I should stop here, but I'll get back sort of and say more specific things about Algeria as an example. I hope that's okay with everyone.
I think that was brilliant, Brahim, and you did a great job on time. You know, and we'll bring it back to you to more pointed questions. I think the framing was really important, especially as we're taking this to kind of inform what are the next stages to understand the continuity of the colonizer and the structures of colonization, and the inheritance and the assumption of these frameworks and institutions and spaces of domination, supremacy, and colonization, whether it's in Algeria, South Africa, and Palestine. And maybe you can also, right after we get to the panelists, maybe provide some key pivotal moments of strength and success that kind of led Algeria, a couple of really key decisions, tactical decisions, but then also miscalculations, so that we could have as an example, ideally, for all of us to use moving forward. On that note, we'll turn to South Africa, which, you know, it was always our hope that Palestine would kind of reach the mainstream cultural status that the anti-apartheid movement had reached. And we figured that would be the beginning of the really close to final phase. And it was, and it remains, just as the Algerian Revolution does, this really almost a wholly beautiful, you know, mass-led, successful revolutionary moment, and at the same time faces the largest wealth gap in the world. And it's on that note that we turn to Naeem Jannah to fill us in on some of the questions that we posed for Naeem, but to also help us understand what's happening now and what we can take away from the South African present condition, as well as the anti-apartheid liberation struggle. Naeem Jannah is a South African academic, author, community leader, activist, and the executive director of the Afro-Middle East Research Center in Johannesburg. He's a part of the Advisory Council of the World Congress for Middle Eastern Studies and a board member of the Dennis Hurley Peace Initiative. Naeem was heavily involved in the struggle against apartheid and remains active in anti-capitalist and anti-war groups and movements across the world. Naeem, I had to cut it short so that we can make more time to actually hear from you. And so I turn it over to you. Thank you, Naeem. And thank you again, Brahim.
Thank you, Lenise. That was already too long. And thank you also to Charlotte and Suzanne for including me in this and giving me this responsibility to speak about South Africa. Brahim, I think I should thank you also for setting the kind of theoretical framework and background for the discussion. I think I'm not going to speak on the theoretical issues, but what you put forward is a good framework within which whatever I might say would fit. So let me get straight into South Africa. First, let me start by saying that the colonial enterprise in South Africa goes back to somewhere between the early and mid 17th century. It kind of loosened, and two colonial powers, but kind of loosened, the colonial enterprise was loosened in the early 20th century. And so that's also the period within which we may speak of an anti-colonial struggle, and I'll explain what I mean. The last major battle, I would say, in the anti-colonial struggle of South Africa was in 1906, what is called the Bambata Rebellion against the British, where 3,000 to 4,000 indigenous South Africans were massacred by the British at that time. Soon after that, in 1910, South Africa became a Union of South Africa. Its relationship to the British Empire weakened, loosened. In 1926, the other Balfour Declaration granted South Africa, as with other colonies, sovereignty. And so from around 1910, we could say that the anti-colonial struggle, in a sense, in South Africa had ended, despite the fact that we continue to talk about decoloniality and all of that, but in terms of the struggle. The struggle changed, and so in 1912, we had the formation of the African National Congress, which was one of many liberation organizations in South Africa, but it was the first in terms of an organization. And the struggle then changed from an anti-colonial struggle where the idea was to get rid of the settlers to a struggle for equality, for citizenship rights, and in particular when the ANC was formed for voting rights. And that in many ways was a very important change in the nature of the struggle. It also meant that Black South Africans at that point were willing to accept that the settlers were South African, that they were part of this country, and that the nature of the struggle needs to change. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the struggle thereafter, except to make one point, and that is, as the struggle unfolded in South Africa, we might talk about the way in which it unfolded, and particularly from the 1950s, 1960s, talk about the broad kind of strategy of struggle in South Africa as resting on four pillars. The first of those pillars was mass mobilization within the country. The second was international solidarity and international isolation of the apartheid state. The third was the building an underground movement within the country. And the fourth was the armed struggle. And this is how we understood and how we prosecuted the struggle at those 4 different levels to lead us to the early 1990s, when in 1990, the various liberation movements that had previously been banned were unbanned. And so this included, among many others, groups such as the African National Congress, Pan-Africanist Congress, the Black Consciousness Movement of Azania, the Communist Party. And so I emphasize negotiations. We did not have a revolution in South Africa, even though the more romantic ones among us would like to think that we did. We had a negotiated settlement. And in 1994, we had our first democratic elections. Since 1994, over the past 26 odd years, we've had significant achievements and impressive achievements in some regards in our country. First and most importantly, of course, is that we had a political transition, a political transformation. Rights were extended to Black people who previously didn't have those rights. We were able to vote for people that we wanted to be in the leadership of our country. And we have had regular elections since then and continue to vote for those people to lead us. Between 1994 and today, we've developed in the mid-1990s a fairly wonderful constitution, liberal democratic, but nevertheless a good constitution that guarantees people's rights, both individual rights as well as collective rights and socioeconomic rights, etc. We've had a government that has engaged in building houses, creches, schools, roads, other infrastructure, and has increased that throughout the country. We've increased the provision of water and electricity in a manner that didn't, as in the past, favor the white population, extended free education and healthcare, attempted to level the playing fields in terms of education and healthcare. We've seen increases and equalization in pensions and social grants in our country. Our constitution emphasizes gender equality, and there have been many attempts to make that a reality in our country. And perhaps one of the successes of that is within our parliament and our government, where that is very much a kind of reality. So we found that our negotiated solution resulted in political liberation, but it also saw us living under continued economic subjugation as Black people. And so today, 85% or so of South Africa's wealth is still in white hands. And in 1990, when the liberation movements were unbanned, the white population was about 12% of the population. It's now less, between 8 and 10, and controls 85% of South Africa's wealth. I think two critical questions, there are many others, but two critical questions that influence what we are, our character today. Two critical questions that we have not dealt with. One is the national question, understanding the question of what is the South African nation and how the different parts of that nation relate to each other. And the second is the question of economic liberation, which we have not dealt with and have not resolved. As part of that second question, I'm not going to deal with the first question unless it comes up in questions. As part of that second question, one of the big issues that continues to be a huge problem is the land question. The distribution or redistribution of land claims among people whose land had been stolen over the past 300 years, 400 years, etc. One of the mechanisms that was put into place as an attempt at redistribution was what was called Black economic empowerment, essentially a kind of affirmative action mechanism or tool to ensure that that wealth was transferred from white hands to Black hands. It has had some success, but the success is basically that we now have a small group of Black faces that has joined the economic elite alongside the white faces that were there already. The masses of Black people have not benefited from that in a substantial way. We also have, from 1994, creeping into our society and our politics and our political economy, various elements of kind of neoliberalism. And I say elements of neoliberalism rather than just saying neoliberalism because our economy also has elements of welfareism that is part of it. We have a social welfare program that is quite substantial compared to other similar countries. But what has happened in the past 26 years is, while some Black faces, as I said, have joined the economic elite, inequality in our country has worsened. And when we say inequality has worsened, when we're talking about the poorest of the poor, we are still talking about Black people. Also, over the past 26 years, service delivery in various regards has not gone as we would like, has been a huge problem, even in the areas in which I said we have made impressive achievements. So, for example, inequality in the education and health sectors remains. Smoothed out a bit, but it remains. Perhaps it's not as stark in terms of the color of one's skin as before, but certainly it's very stark in terms of class. Unemployment is sitting at the moment, by the narrow definition, at over 30%. Any of the North African countries that we might think of, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, etc., have unemployment that is less than half of what we're talking about in South Africa. Despite having a democratically elected government, largely a Black government, a police force that is largely Black, police brutality and even torture in our prisons has not gone away. During the COVID-19 lockdown period over the past 7 months or so, 9 poor Black people were killed by our security forces, soldiers and police. Gender-based violence in South Africa, despite a wonderful constitution, as I said, that talks about gender equality and all of those kinds of great things, gender-based violence has made South Africa one of the worst cases in the world in terms of the treatment of women and violence against women in particular. Water provision, as I said, has been extended, but today around 80% of poor people in our country have no running water. A higher proportion have no toilets. And one of the tragedies, real ironical tragedies, in 2000, in the year 2000, in a place in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, there was an instance where the local municipality decided that they're going to install prepaid water meters for the community, and people had to pay for their water. People who in the apartheid era were getting that water, minimal water, through community taps, but nevertheless were getting it for free. As a result, poor people went down to the river to get their water, and a cholera outbreak broke out that lasted for about 4 years. 50 people died as a result of it. Hundreds were infected by it, and all of this because our democratically elected government had decided that people should pay for their water. People who previously had received that water for free. We have today in South Africa a culture in the public service in general of not caring for the most marginalized and impoverished in our society. For many people in the political elite, it is because, quote, it's now our turn to eat, whatever there is to be eaten. And so corruption in our country has resulted in our, particularly our state-owned enterprises, but our economy more generally being quite ravaged. We have all of this, in a sense, comes out of the fact that, as Ronnie Casserels, who was commander in the ANC's armed wing in CounterRevolution, then Minister of Water Affairs, Deputy Minister of Defense, and Minister of Intelligence, and today now is the convener of the South African BDS coalition. He refers to this to the origin of these problems as being the Faustian Pact that South Africa got into when we accepted, just before our first election, accepted an IMF loan, when we agreed that a democratic South Africa would pay off the apartheid debt that was incurred by the apartheid government in order to repress white people. When we look back to the early 90s, that while we had political negotiations that were open, transparent, into which civil society and all sectors of our society were able to make inputs, that there were secret negotiations taking place between South African and British capitalists, together with ANC economic experts, that led us to not the social democratic program that we were talking about outside in public, but to a more liberal, neoliberal program that was imposed in 1996. And so the Freedom Charter that the ANC had adopted, which many of us in the 70s and 80s regarded as being a bit too liberal for the kind of South Africa we would like to see, the Freedom Charter goals for wealth redistribution and socialization of minds, etc., all of that fell by the wayside. Lamis, I think I'm coming to the end of my time, am I?
Yes, you are, and it's a great place to end, because I think
if you allow me, let me just say one last thing, and I want to say this particularly because of Brahim's comment about how colonial masters had no trust in our people to be able to govern themselves, etc. Ronnie Casserels, in speaking about this Faustian Pact, says, and I'm going to end on this quote, he said, "Inexcusably, we had lost faith in the ability of our own revolutionary masses to overcome all obstacles. To lose our nerve was not necessary or inevitable. The ANC leadership needed to remain determined, united, and free of corruption, and above all, to hold on to its revolutionary will. Instead, we chickened out. The ANC leadership needed to remain true to its commitment of serving the people. This would have given it the hegemony it required, not only over the entrenched capitalist class, but over emergent elitists, many of whom would seek wealth through black economic empowerment, corrupt practices, and selling political influence." And having given that quote, you will see that if we talk about lessons for Palestine, that in fact, the Palestinian political elite is already sunk into that same hole. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Naeem, and exactly what we wanted to get from this segment. And you leave us on a note that I hope you, along with the other panelists, will flesh out a little bit further. And, you know, we talk about these failures, but really it becomes to me, or in my mind, a failure to dismantle the foundations of knowledge and education, European, neoliberal, Western, capitalist, globalized means of intellectual production and thought that was internalized, and the supplanting of native practices, communal knowledge development. And it'll be interesting to ask you later whether or what efforts were taken to kind of end the internalization of the white and West practices, this kind of blind entry into the global market and adoption of these neoliberal practices, how that was related to, you know, white domination of education systems, this internalization, what could have been dismantled, what could have been done better leading up to and as the anti-apartheid movement was reaching places of success. And I think it's great that we've got Tawfiq Haddad next, who can also elaborate a bit more about what we refer to specifically when we talk about the role of neoliberalization and neoliberal institutions and practices. And I'm sure that Tawfiq will also offer not just some insights into what's happening for Palestine for us to absorb the lessons of Algeria and South Africa, but to also offer a mirror in which other movements can also see what's happened and what is happening now so that we can navigate this, as Brahim had noted. Tawfiq Haddad, our next panelist, is a Palestinian author, journalist, publisher, academic, UK-based teaching fellow, and currently based and working in Al-Quds, Palestine. Tawfiq authored one of the most important pieces on Oslo entitled Palestine Ltd. Limited, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territory. It's the most comprehensive analysis of Oslo's neoliberal frameworks and their role in the political, social, and economic repression and disaster capitalism in Palestine. He was also the co-author of Between the Lines, Readings in Israel, the Palestinians and the US War on Terror, and Towards a New Internationalism. I'm going to skip through some of this. Tawfiq has also worked in various Palestinian-based organizations, including the Deal Center for Residency and Refugee Rights and the Alternative Information Center. On that note, I turn it to, sorry, you're flinching. Correct me if I'm wrong. I couldn't find you for a bio. So yeah, make any corrections, Tawfiq, and please go for it.
That's fine, Lamise. Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you and all the other organizers, Charlotte and Suzanne in particular, for their efforts in really providing an amazing, not obviously an opportunity but to speak to this audience, but also I must say, like, for as long as I've known you folks, 20 years of steadfast organizing, which is exactly the kind of stuff that I feel we need. So kudos to you, and thank you for organizing. Thank you to the other panelists as well. In fact, I very much appreciated listening to Brahim and Naeem. In particular, Naeem, I found what was so important about his talk was how he gives us a sense of the longue durée of revolution, and how revolution is a process fundamentally. It has evolving challenges and rises and falls at different stages. It's important to acknowledge important achievements and set clear goals and set up for yourselves how we're going to understand the problem, organize a solution around it, and then keep the struggle going, because ultimately we do believe that no one is free until everyone is free, to be frank. And that should be, I think, the ethos that we'd like to embody in our causes. And the Algerian and South African struggle very much speak to that. Yes, both struggles made very important achievements in the case of Algeria, the liberation in 1961 or 62, and South Africa's transition, of course, but it wasn't over. And now, of course, when we bring that sort of analysis to the question of Palestine, it's obviously the need is because Palestine is very much deep in the throes of 120-year struggle that involves a very aggressive settler colonial project that is very much empowered and very much heavily militarized and aggressive right now. And the Palestinians are in a very difficult situation right now. We need to have a kind of sobriety and humility in analyzing where we stand today, and be realistic about what's possible in the current conditions and what might be possible under changing conditions. And I think it's important to introduce that element, because revolution and decolonization and talking about all this stuff sort of has elements of romantic euphoria about it. But on the other side of the coin, revolution and revolutionaries and movements and organizations need to deal with real practical problems of organization, of tactics, of strategy, of finance, of procedure, of leadership, of inclusion and exclusion, and they need to make real decisions in real times and places. The history of every revolution is how they try to answer those. And I don't have the time or space right now to go into what happened entirely in the Palestinian situation. But we do need to be sober about it. We need to be inclusive of it. We need to have a mature discussion about that, so to speak, and not simply like, there's this expression in Arabic that says takhween, which is to sort of say, to make somebody an apostate or somebody simply for raising alternative opinions. We need to be able to be bottom up and accountable and democratic in our organizing, and then unite and move forward collectively, and then reassess if we don't make the right decisions. In any case, for all that sort of theoretical stuff to speak with in the beginning, I wanted to simply start by sort of acknowledging how in fact, the de facto weakness of the Palestinian situation right now. We are probably in one of the weakest stages of our history, arguably. I mean, on some level, we made very important achievements historically. We have gotten the attention of the international community. We have a whole pile of international resolutions that are in our favor. We have various forms of recognition. But in many ways, we are also on the brink of very serious threats. The nature, Israel is basically going for all-out ethnic cleansing. And if it can do it, it will do it in 20, 30 years. And we have to understand that as part of the dynamic of the internal mechanism of Israel, because simply it cannot sustain a Jewish democratic state or even a Jewish state with a self-organized Palestinian community on the ground of Palestine. And today we have up to a little bit more than 50% of the population in historical Palestine is Arab, Palestinian, Christian, and even Jewish, but not Jewish Zionist Israeli. So they have a fundamental problem there. And everything about the internal ideological and political bent of this project tells us that at every opportunity, they will try to weaken us and potentially expel us. And we have to take that threat very seriously, especially in the context of the weakness of the Arab world today, where before you used to have Palestine be a kind of litmus test, or the Arabs wouldn't normalize with Israel, and even the whole third world wouldn't normalize with Israel until there was recognition of Palestinian rights. Today, we see a fundamental delinking of the Palestinian struggle, where historical allies like India or even China now have open relations with Israel and big trading partnerships and military partnerships. And now you have, the Arabs themselves doing it as well, as we just recently saw with Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. This is a very serious situation that we're in. There's a sort of a collapse and a shift of a historical and global proportions that's taking place. I don't say that to freak anybody out but just that we're serious about it in our organizing, and that we need to be serious about how we approach it. And when we start to be serious about approaching it, we just basically need to understand what's going on as much as possible. We need to study it. I mean, fundamentally, Israel is a project of Western imperialism in this region that was supported to keep the Arab world divided. That's why they kept it exactly in the place between North Africa and the Levant region. It was supposed to be the protectorate of the Suez Canal between the two key colonies of Egypt and India. It was an infrastructure, as Ibrahim said, the infrastructure of imperialism in the Eastern Levant. And its significance has not gone away. The Arab world still has sort of a latent Arab national sentiment to it that poses a potential challenge to Europe. The Arab world still has, for the key choke points across this key region of the Straits of Hormuz, the Gibraltar Straits, the Suez Canal, and Bab el-Mandeb. These are key choke points in global capitalism's trade links. And this is still the most shortest route between East and West. And so it's always going to be key there. I expect this audience knows plenty of all this sort of stuff. I don't need to go into it, but Israel's significance is not going away. And if America is thinking in its recent isolationism under Trump and sort of potentially getting out of the Middle East, of course they're not. But the point is Israel's significance is going up. And but the point here is to emphasize that it is a global set of factors that are keeping Israel supported and flush with money and diplomatic support and political support. And actually, the Palestinians at this stage, through their disorganization, do not pose a significant enough challenge to even to threaten those global links. And that's a problem because when we want to talk about how we're going to achieve Palestinian liberation or what are the lessons of it, we have to have a strategy to be able to counter both the global set of forces that are against us, but also what's going on within the mechanisms of Zionism and Israel itself, because we have two different sets of things going on. We have global capitalism and imperialism, but we've also got this fascistic sort of Zionist movement that has its own historical trajectory linked to nationalism and what happened in World War II and the history of anti-Semitism. And we even have to have answers for that too. Now, I'm not going to go into all those questions right now, but I do want to sort of begin to perhaps reflect upon some of what we can learn from history and from the lessons of our struggle in the past. One of them was that, I think the Palestine movement was probably strongest. Actually, it depends how you want to define the Palestine movement. I mean, there's the Palestinian national movement itself, or there's the cause of Palestine. So if we actually roll back history and look at what happened in 1956 when Nasser closes or sort of nationalizes the Suez Canal, and in the period soon after that, basically, if you remember, in 1956, actually Israel occupies the Gaza Strip and the entire Suez Canal and Suez Peninsula. Eisenhower steps in and he actually forces Israel to retreat. And actually, this episode signifies the end of British and French sort of imperial endeavors in the Middle East at the time. I mean, or at least significantly weakens them. In 1967, the US didn't do that. They allowed Israel to take both those territories again and hold on to them as basically bartering chips. And then they basically bartered Sinai with Egypt, and they cut out Egypt from the thing. And Gaza is still that bone stuck in their throat, so to speak. But part of that is just to say that basically in that period, the Palestine cause was actually one of its strongest because you had an organized Arab movement and world that was trying to pose, and it was mobilized, and it was part of this sort of anti-colonial struggle and attempt to create a non-aligned movement, and was trying to do something different. And Eisenhower understood it. He understood he couldn't roll back history and say that colonialism was just, they couldn't go back to the old colonialism the way it had been, especially in the post-World War II period. That doesn't mean the forces of colonialism and what generated colonialism went away, but it meant that they were weak at the time. And we see with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the collapse of third world movements, we see the same forces of colonialism coming back with a vengeance and moving forward. Another one of the important lessons, though, that is not just that when the Arab world was mobilized, but also Palestine was very strong post-67, and then also in the First Intifada. Post-67 period is basically when you have one of the most radical periods in contemporary 20th century, where you had a global left forces that were out there, that were speaking and talking about all the different connections between Palestine, between so many other movements inside each country and between each country, Vietnam and a whole ton of other struggles, Cuba, whatever. So much was going on, and that left, the organization of the international left created basically a nest within which Palestine could situate itself and be a part and parcel of it because it was part of that language. Also, in the first Intifada period, you have another significant moment when Palestinian movement is quite strong, is at its strongest, because you had a mobilized population on the ground in the territories, very clear, with clear leadership, clear political goals, making clear claims to Israelis, to the West, about, very simple principles of like no taxation without representation, end occupation. We don't want this. How long is an occupation supposed to last? And this resonated and had a lot of strength because I would argue the democratic and popular base of the movement. Now, that doesn't. I don't have time to go into analyzing exactly what went wrong or what I'm really trying to say is those are some of the lessons of what's needed in our struggle. Historically, some of the major failures that we've had, which I think is also important to point to, are the fact that crucial points in this struggle, we had the PLO movement basically, it's complicated to go into, but basically when the military struggle and the guerrilla movements came up after 67, the Arab states entered the fold and identified Fatah movement as the least radical of the radical revolutionary groups. And this was done specifically to kind of weaken the revolutionary potential of the movement, because Fatah had an explicit ideological and political component to their platform, which said that they didn't want to interfere in the internal matters of the Arab states. And that basically meant that they were not trying to be revolutionaries, they were just at large, representing some sort of much larger political revolutionary force, but they were just going to focus on Palestine. And the consequences of this eventually meant that, particularly through the financial dependency, that the money allowed them to build the PLO, but it also allowed them to build it along a political, with certain political conditionalities, as well as legal conditionalities that would later have dire consequences, particularly the adoption of the sort of 2-4-2, two-state solution approach. Now here, I think it's important to say that
Yeah, if you could just wrap up, and then we can kind of elicit some of what you want to say. But if you could just give us like a 30-second wrap up, because we're quite a bit over time, and then we'll follow up with questions after Obey is done, if that's okay, Tawfiq.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
I'm going to quit going through the questions, going through the mistakes right now, because there's certainly too much to talk about there. I do want to say that I think at this stage, what our movement really needs, we can glean from some of this experience that we need to build institutions, we need to have real leadership that is accountable to its base. We have to develop and take seriously the question of procedures, and because that leads to questions of inclusion. We need to develop independent forms of finance, because we have never really solved that. And there is also never any substitute for political strategy. And in this game, political strategy means you have to understand the big board game and then the local board game. And the final part of this, Lamis, if you'll just let me say is the local board game is actually most important here. And this is the most important thing that I'd like to get across, which is that the architecture of Zionist power that facilitates Israel normalization around the world has a different structure and character to it in each locale. So for that reason, we need to study the local and map it, and then understand our own sets of resources and what we have, so that we can basically be strategic about how we are going to isolate and identify key targets that can be used to popularize our cause and weaken theirs fundamentally. I can go into that more later, but basically we also need research at this stage, because especially in a period of transition, and we'll talk about that more later.
Thanks, Tawfiq. Actually, that's perfect. And that's really where we're trying to go with this, not just for Palestine, but also for South Africa and Algeria, and kind of develop this together. And that is what will address later, kind of moving away from these neoliberal, foreign-dependent models of sustenance and survival. And, I'd like you to also start considering, and I'm sure Ubay will touch upon this more, we talked a lot about the internationalist framing, but also we do need more detail about the Palestinian national movement. So if you can talk a little bit more about that in the question session, and I'll pose that to you, which brings us to our final panelist, but not the end of the session, a hero to many people, a recently released political prisoner, a server and sacrificer for the Palestinian community his entire life. He's been everything from the program coordinator and supervisor at the YWCA to the M&E officer at the Union of Agricultural Committees, working with farmers, to now being the executive director of the Bisan Research Center for the Research of and Development. He's a husband to Hind Shraide, one of the most epic and powerful women I've ever met, and a father of 3 children. I've cut down, Ubay, the bio, you'll forgive me as we're short on time, and the areas of interest are in research, labor, food sovereignty, and social movements, macroeconomics, and development. And Ubay will begin by setting us off with a bit more about the local. Thank you, Ubay, and welcome home.
Okay, thank you, Lamis, and thanks for everyone, and thanks for the solidarity. I would like to jump straight in with the issues because of the time constraint also. The main idea, I totally agree with what Tawfiq said, that we are facing a continuous ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people by the Zionist regime and its international allies. And this ethnic cleansing, which sometimes has a higher rate, sometimes has a lower rate, will always continue as long as the Palestinian people are subjugated. And its end aim is the end aim of every ethnic cleansing process, which is to break up and transform the Palestinian people from a coherent nation into to people that are defeated, adopting the Israeli and Zionist historical narrative, and even most of them outside of historic Palestine. Okay, for the question of how can we use the lessons of South Africa and Algeria in our own situation, I think one of the most important issues is that if we understand that the historic process of Zionism in Palestine and imperialism was to disenfranchise and break down the Palestinian people and treating us as minorities or as geographical people situated in geographical areas, or even sometimes according to discrimination according to religion, Christians, Muslims, Druze, Palestinian Jews, etc. Then the main thing should be also to counter that by having mass organization. Mass organization is one of the most important things that we have, and we were very successful at mass organization historically, and there were periods that when mass organization has failed, or we haven't, or the leadership has actually failed the masses, that the spirit of mass organization, mass solidarity has weakened among the Palestinians also. This kind of mass organization is actually one of the main reasons for the victories of all national liberation movements. This has been transformed in usually in a wide united national front, as the cases of Algeria, the case also of South Africa. In South Africa especially, it had a large democratic base, grassroots organizations, meeting, discussing, having representatives go to national conferences, etc., and being able to organize the masses around key and clear demands, political demands of freedom, emancipation, etc. Self-reliance as a means of for emancipation. Already we have in Palestine the notions of food sovereignty, agroecology, development through popular protection, which is a notion that was conceived in Palestine in the first Intifada. Those notions are of key importance to counteracting not just the effects of neocolonialism, but also the effects of the neoliberal policies that have been implemented in Palestine. In Palestine today, in situation under chronic, or not chronic, or under prolonged colonization, we have billionaires living side by side with masses of people that are under the poverty line. And this actually was not this was not a byproduct of the occupation, but was actually determined through the policies of what kind of occupation, of what kind of policies, economic policies the occupation will have, and what kind of arrangements it had with the PA and the PLO, and then its successor, the PA, determining when and how to challenge also the occupation. In the first Intifada, for example, we had our own agenda of when to have general mass strikes, when to have oppositions movements to the occupation, when to have civil disobedience acts, etc. After that, we kind of lost the compass, and the Palestinian actions became mostly reactions. The continuous Zionist onslaught of our people has not stopped from even before 1948, from 1947, even before that. But it did not stop at that, but it also continued actually sometimes to provoke certain, I would call certain reactions from the Palestinian people, from its resistance to the occupation. And some of those reactions were actually capitalized on by the Israeli Zionist regime, and to further, I would say, to further weaken or delegitimize the Palestinian resistance movement for the Israeli Zionist occupation of Palestine. Having those issues in mind, we have also to have realistic key priorities of action on what can be done on the short notice level or on the short run, and what can also be done on the long run, the medium and the long run. I totally agree with what Tawfiq said, is that the situation today is not like in the 80s or in the 60s or in the 50s. But the situation today, the international situation, the Palestinian situation on the ground has also greatly differed. So if we do not take that into account, the objective situation that we find ourselves in, not just the political, but also the social and the economic situation, we will not be able to devise coherent policies and to counteract those difficulties that we are facing towards our national liberation. For example, one of the key issues that we have to work on today is reigniting the connections of the solidarity between the Palestinians, not just with the on the international scene, but also on the local scene. I'm talking about the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and the Palestinians that are present in the Palestine that was occupied in 1948. These connections between Palestinians are today at the weakest, I would say, at the weakest moments. National organizing movements, bodies, institutions have mostly dissolved that used to coordinate. So we need those bodies again. One of the main benefits was of the PLO that it represented Palestinians everywhere. one of the main issues that happened in signing the Oslo Accords is that the PLO willingly gave up the representation of the 1 million Palestinians that was back in 1992, but today we are talking about around 2.1 or 2.2 million Palestinians that have Israeli, that the Israeli ID or the Israeli citizenship was forced upon them. And those 2.2 million Palestinians are a key part of any discourse on national liberation, on emancipation, on building a better future for the Palestinians. This solidarity actually is being counteracted by, and these connections were counteracted by several Israeli policies that have started since signing before even actually signing the Oslo Accords, but have taken after that a stronger step for that. For example, the isolation of the Palestinians from the West Bank, from their relatives, and even their neighbors that have Israeli IDs, because the areas in the West Bank were very much connected with Palestinian towns and neighborhoods that existed in Palestine that was occupied in 1948, the part of Palestine that was occupied in 1948. Those connections were social, economic, cultural, and the occupation has worked systematically on cutting those connections. Another kind of connections were the connections between the West Bank and the Palestine occupied in 1948 and Gaza. Those connections are today almost completely cut. They remain, of course, on the emotional level, but when you're talking about, if you review the statistics for it, for social, for marriages, for economic relations, etc., Gaza is under blockade, and the first people that were cut off from Gaza are the Palestinians in other areas. Another important thing is establishing real working models of self-reliance, Palestinian self-reliance on the ground. Cooperatives, cultural centers, producers cooperatives, unions, etc., even academic unionization or academic bodies, etc. Those people actually, or those models of self-reliance are of key importance, because today what has been thrust on Palestinians is a model of high reliance on foreign aid and I would say, employment through the government sector that is dependent on transfers from the Israeli authorities, from the Israeli occupation. So if those transfers do not come every month, and if those donations that do not come every month or every year from EU countries, the US for a certain period of time, Arab countries, etc., then you would have a crippling of the Palestinian economy in the West Bank and Gaza. And instead of having a productive economy, what we have was a model of reliance on foreign aid or foreign investment, not investment, it's foreign aid. But this foreign aid came at a high price. The high price of that foreign aid is destroying Palestinian self-reliance. And when we had, for this example, one of the main manifestations of the Palestinian self-reliance, of the problems in that, is, for example, if you look about the area of cultivated land in the West Bank and Gaza, the area actually has decreased since 1992 by around 33%. And in 1992, we had around 22% of the labor force working in the West Bank and Gaza working in agriculture. Today, we have less than 8%. And if we take those figures on what do they mean for the national liberation movement, we are saying that if you're talking about farmers that are working on subsistence economy, then those farmers are not reliant on market relations, are not also reliant on the occupation, the export of their products, etc. But what they are reliant, they are self-sufficient inside their village, inside their smaller community, and they can continue producing in spite of the hardships. Today, when these lands have been neglected, the occupation has now actually started taking more and more lands of the Palestinians, and this is what has been possible today for the Israelis and for the Trump administration to support the annexation plan of most of the Palestinian lands that have been due to those policies neglected and not cultivated. Another thing, important thing that
we're going to ask you, Ubay, after you wrap up that final one, and then we can kind of bring back and help elicit some of these points. So maybe just close on the next point, and we'll go into the questions segment.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just want to say that we can also create as many as possible democratic grassroots organizations that connect and organize and work with each other as part of the national liberation movement and also as part of the Palestinian self-reliance movement. Those grassroots, although we had a strong history in creating those, but today they are mostly absent from the scene, and they have been actually marginalized by the traditional leadership of the PLO for those, because it was not democratic, so it did not have in its interest having strong grassroots organizations that can challenge their authority and that can challenge their opinions on what should be done and where we should be going. I would like to just wrap up and saying also that Palestinians are not alone. We are not weak. We have the solidarity of our people. We have the solidarity of the masses of worldwide, and this actually makes us very strong. And we have the means to access this kind of strength if we organize and if we take advantage of opportunities on the local and international level when they present themselves.
Thank you, Ubay. I mean, I think it's fantastic that even as you're coming out of a Zionist dungeon, a Zionist prison camp, military camp, that you really embody and kind of internalize this sense of hope and power. And I think that that's been critical to the Palestinian struggle under the biggest of odds, but to all revolutionary struggles. You know, you've been talking a lot about self-reliance, and Brahim mentioned a bit about, yes, that there was the emancipation of the land, but there wasn't an emancipation of the people. And so I think the first set of questions, which I'm collapsing from our own discussions previously and our notes together, but also incorporating some of the questions that were posed by the attendees and sent to me by Suzanne, Michael, and Charlotte. I'm going to go back to you, Brahim. You laid a brilliant intellectual framework, but I'm going to bring it back to you to kind of inform us as briefly as possible about the current conditions and protests that are happening in Algeria, the counter-revolutionary elements, touching a bit about that, but then also elaborating on the missteps and the miscalculations that allowed for the prolonging of colonization or the inheritance of colonial structures by this new comprador class. If you can give us a few details and some examples about this and elaborate a bit more of what would have emancipation of the people look like.
Thank you, Lamis, for that question. Maybe if I can just step for 1 second sort of to the moment of independence, right? And what happened at independence, at the moment of independence in Algeria, you had the founding act of the nascent Algerian state was a coup d'etat, a military coup d'etat. So where you had sort of military units that were stationed in Tunisia and in Morocco on the borders. They were armed by, with the help of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and Hassan second in Morocco. But in cahoots, the French, they released there is what is known in Algeria. De Gaulle in 58 realized that he could not hold on to Algeria, and what they did was that they wanted to implode it from within. So you had an influx of Algerians who were actually serving in the French army as officers. They went and joined, or as others say, infiltrated the military units that were in Tunisia and in Morocco, and because they had the training, they made their way into the Algerian army. So the first act those military units came in the summer of '62 was to kill 2,000 fighters in the interior in Algeria and take power by force. These very sort of military personnel, they make their way over the next couple of decades into the top echelons of the Algerian military. By the mid-'80s, they become generals. By the late '80s, they are in control. For example, General Khalid Nazar, who was one of the eight generals who partook in the coup d'etat in '92 in Algeria, 7 of them had served in the French army in the '50s. They were actually fighting to keep Algeria a French colony. And this is part of, I can't go into all of this. I've written about this stuff elsewhere. So, for those who are interested in this sort of sociology of elites, they can look at it elsewhere. But it's important to highlight it. To highlight there was a class of administrators, there was a class of collaborators who France refused. After '62, they refused to take them into France. So they stayed in Algeria. And because of the trainings that they had, they become part and parcel of the bureaucracy and the state structures. In '92, that's what happens, the first democratic election in the region, under sort of the guise of fighting Islamist, potential Islamist takeover of power, they carry out a coup d'etat, and what happens afterwards is we have over 200,000 people killed, over 18,000 or 20,000 people who have disappeared. Algerian mothers, until today, there are Algerian mothers who don't know where their kids are. There are Algerian political prisoners who have been in prison for 28 years, longer than Mandela. Until today, they are in prisons. So this is the nature of the elites that come to power. And Algerians today, the movement that started last year and still ongoing, is aware of this, is aware of the coloniality of their present. And it's about decolonizing. Algerians on the street over the last year and a half, they're saying, they're chanting slogans such as, "Is this a state or colonial administration?" The people last year on the anniversary of independence, people on the streets of Algiers in their millions were chanting, "The people want independence." So returning to the idea about these local elites or national bourgeoisies, in some ways, someone earlier put on a quote from Fanon. I agree with Fanon, but I think we need to go further. Because they don't have these elites. They are, if we're talking about this military oligarchy in Algeria, for example, that has killed tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people and has plundered the country and moved that money into French, in some ways into Emirati banks, into American banks, and so on. They have no choice. They have no choice but to obey the orders that they get from their masters. People who have jurisdiction over their ill-gotten wealth. they can't walk the streets in Algeria. They have no, they have no legitimacy at home. So they are, and they can't go to Paris or to New York or to London, because if they don't actually implement the orders that they get from their masters, they'll be, they'll be taken out. So
thank you, Brahim. So we're gonna kind of maybe bring this line of questioning to the other panelists and then bring it back to you about, what's happening on the ground, what have been the strategies to deal with this class. I always get a good chuckle when in some of my presentations, I often say, and I use the final phases, especially in the Algerian liberation struggle. And I referred to Beni Oui, and it wasn't until reading your work and kind of speaking to you that I understood that this Beni Oui wasn't all actually erased or removed from the Algerian scene, but rather it's inherited through violence and political favor and relationships, very structured in the placement of the colonizers. So I bring it back to Naim, Tawfiq, and Ubay. If you could do your best, it's a rather complicated and heavy question. This issue, Tawfiq, you talked about, balancing a middle ground between not engaging in takhween, in kind of the erasure of any logic and reasoning, so that we can make justifiably so a reasoned analysis that can help us deconstruct and figure out the next steps. But also it's clear across the board, whether it's in South Africa, Palestine, or Algeria, that there is a very sinister, clear role of the comprador class, from the conscious to the kind of initially perhaps somewhat innocent, well-intentioned, that ultimately fall within the framework of being blackmailed by ways of corruption or self-motivation. The 1% that's gotten wealthier in South Africa, the new middle class that's able to gain resources through political relationships, the social and political classes that are formed in Palestine through political movements themselves. So the question becomes, how do we manage and navigate, and what tangible tools, or how do you assess, and for you as well, Ubay, what is the left kind of assessment of the Palestinian Authority and even the new NGO-based kind of social political class? How do we relate to them? How do we address them as allies, and also as Palestinians or Algerians or South Africans in diaspora? How do we relate to them, and how do we deal with them? And I'm going to turn to Naim to go first, if that's okay with you, Naim, yeah? And how is that being addressed also in South Africa, Yani? What is happening now to address these issues?
Yeah, I think, Lamis, can I hear Tawfiq and Ubay first? I think the question was more focused on Palestine.
Well, it is and it isn't. You spoke a lot about the great reforms that were happening in South Africa, Naim, but also expounded about the huge wealth gap, this new middle class, which many researchers say is a middle class that was formed through its relationships to political power and to economic power. So, just kind of understanding, also informing us, what, if any, of the dynamics that Brahim has described and that I've described have played a role in fomenting this sort of wealth gap and the inequity in South Africa. But I'll start with Tawfiq, if that's okay, and we'll come back to you, Naim.
Okay, it's a complicated question, but I will try and be clear about it. And just because we're talking to an audience who knows general stuff and doesn't need, but may not know specifics about stuff on the ground. Basically, Oslo was a scenario where, does everyone hear me? Yeah. Oslo was a scenario where you had all the popular committees of the first Intifada mobilized and demanding, quote, radical change as from an Israeli or an American perspective. Okay. The Oslo solution was to bring in the PLO under Fatah guidance to basically be the local administrator of the show and to basically push out and replace all those popular movements which were arising because there was obviously because the occupation and the civil administration, but there was also very real need. So basically, the World Bank came in, designed a governance structure, called it the Palestinian Authority, inserted Fatah into it, controlled all the purse strings for it. So basically, a third of the PA's budget comes from the Israelis through the VAT check that comes in monthly. A third comes from the Europeans, and a third is generated locally through taxes, but even less than a third. So basically 2/3 of the Palestinian Authority's budget comes from them. So the PA is basically a big NGO that was created to absorb unemployment, to provide those services that the Israelis didn't want to do, including both the security and the education and the health, the basic things like that, and to manage the situation. It was a management solution because Israel actually still had the contradiction of the Jewish Zionist state, Jewish democratic state, and all these Palestinians who are saying, get out of here, and this is my land. So, the current situation is basically with the sort of, if you want to take the comprador class thing, I think I would be cautious. I mean, like, yes, Fatah played that role. They did it. Firstly, they did it. That was part of their politics. It led them down that line. I disagree with what they did, but also we did not have a serious counter movement to that at the time that could organize, that was politically solvent and cohesive enough to counter that. And there were also huge global dynamics taking place at the time. And so the fault is not just on Fatah, although they bear responsibility for the political decisions that they made. They also bet on the two-state solution, but also, to be frank, the Palestinian left did not actually offer enough of a counter to that back in the day. They said if the Palestinian people accept that, then they would. So there was sort of a slow weakening of political position there. Now, also, an important point, not to get too lost on the point, about particularly around the comprador thing. Fatah is basically playing a game where they are taking all the money as much as they can, and they're giving it to their people to create a kind of self-sustaining, recycled sort of money so that they can have it for a rainy day, basically. Now, okay, the business class in Palestine, the big business class in Palestine is actually not super in favor of Fatah. They do back them sometimes. They can be squeezed locally, but actually their sphere of accumulation is outside of the occupied territories. They make their money in the Gulf, in America, who knows where. It's not that they rely upon Palestine to milk for their huge wealth. They are making money there, but the fact of the matter is, Fatah is a set of contradictions. They're high businessmen and they're refugee camp kids. And in the end of the day, Israel killed Arafat. The World Bank and the Americans killed Arafat. They did that because Fatah always likes to try and straddle the contradictions of being revolutionaries, but also being players in the game. And so I think we need to be cautious about, saying that Fatah is fully a sellout. They're playing a long game. It's not our game. It's not our politics. But are we offering an alternative? That's the question. And what we really need to be doing is what Abay is talking about on the local scene is rebuilding the Palestinian movement. But to be frank to your audience, who I imagine most of whom are not actually in Palestine today, leave those debates to the side for now. Understand them, but let's not make those issues much deeper. And let's work in your locality to really understand, what's your role in this struggle? Where do Americans or French or whatever who are listening to this, or South Africans, what can they do? Because those struggles, okay, it's important to keep informed of that. But to be frank, the enemy still is Israel, Zionism, Western imperialism, etc. And that's what we need to be doing, and isolate and studying them and understanding our resources and matching it.
Fantastic. That was perfect and spot on, Tawfiq. And the understanding also is, Tawfiq, I think it's important. We do have a lot of Palestinians who are not in Palestine, but a lot of Palestinians across the world, the majority actually, who are navigating these issues as you see all of these diaspora or international efforts to kind of be part of building the local, right? To take an active part from the outside to build the local, as you described and as Ubay described. And I turn it over to you, Ubay, to add on or offer different perspectives and to maybe fill in a little bit of where you left off, if that's okay with you.
Okay, thank you. I have to say I totally agree with what Tawfiq said. So I want to build upon that. The main idea is to have our focus on where we can do real change, not get entangled in side battles and going Palestinians against each other and battling each other for, because I think we have enough challenges against us. Even the PA today with its role, with its even limited discourse, I would say it's limited vocabulary discourse against the occupation is not accepted by the Israeli right wing as they even want to destroy that, even that even with the role that it's doing strategically of elongating, I think, the Zionist project in Palestine. The thing is that we need to build our own discourse. We need to build our own movement. We need to build our own grassroots, because if the people go to the streets, if the people start organizing, if the people start to take power, it will be very difficult for any regime, any occupation force to start taking back that power from the people. In Palestine, the main people that are marginalized, the poor, are the youth. Also, you have its segments. 50% of our population is under 20 years old. 70% of our population is under 30 years old, and those are not even represented in any political leadership of any party. So you can take it from the far left to the far right. This segment of the population is not even represented in any way. Women are also, they are the oppressed of the oppressed. They face a patriarchal community, and they face also the situation of the occupation, and their issues are being hijacked by a couple of plush NGOs that are receiving foreign funding and talking about everything except real Palestinian women's problems that they face on the daily basis with the occupation, with the violence from the occupation. Not even, I can't even remember, because my organization, we work on women's issues. I can't even remember the last time that the UN or an international body came out with a statement concerning occupation violence against Palestinian women, even a statement in that direction. So for the PA and the NGOs, I think the priorities of their leadership is not with the Palestinian people. Their priorities are self-driven, self-interest. I did a research a year back. I actually finished it. I was able to barely finish it before my incarceration, for my arrest. It dealt with the development model that they presented, and the PA and the NGO sector presented or adopted, and it was called it a privatized development. They wanted to privatize Palestinian development into their own pockets, into their own benefits. So we might have public institutions and public investment, and we might have people that are talking about social justice and socioeconomic rights, but in the end result, they are only benefiting their own pockets, they are only benefiting their own well-being, and this is actually has become even very evident for the Palestinian, even for the Palestinian community. Today, you can critique the PA, but if you talk about the Palestinian telecommunications company, Paltel, you will find yourself arrested and harassed by the security apparatus. So it's a well-established regime, I would say. The way to push back is getting back to the rights. We have a rights movement, and we start demanding our rights from the bottom up. We don't have today any real labor organization, any real women's unions. We don't have any real youth movements, etc. And those can be organized, those can be worked with, and they necessarily will push back against PA policies, against the private sector, against donor policies in Palestine. They are all incoherence, and even against the occupation. One of the main things that I would like to say that if you take, for example, the FAO, the World Food Organization, they have a lot of interventions in Palestine, but all of their interventions are coordinated with the Israeli military command in the for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So if you see that all of these interventions, what they do in the end result is link Palestinian farmers, Palestinian producers to the Israeli market, and thus contribute to the colonization and contribute to the or contribute to a situation of reliance on the occupation instead of emancipation from it.
That was brilliant, perfect and spot on, Ubay. Naeem, do you want to touch, or do you want to touch a bit about this, or do you want to pass on the question?
Let me make a quick comment. Look, I think that in South Africa, South Africa to a large extent until 1994 had generated its own capital. Many of the big companies that operated in South Africa were South African companies. And so the kind of the notion of comprador or of our elites being beholden to outsiders is a little different. It brings to mind the analysis of the South African Communist Party about apartheid. And not that I necessarily agree with the whole analysis, but they refer to South Africa as not the classical type of colonialism, but colonialism of a special type. It was a kind of internal colonialism. And so the new black elite that is beholden to capital, or is part of capital, not just the middle class, but actually the capital class, is beholden to a capital class that is local to a large extent, not foreign. Even, I mentioned earlier on that the South African government, the democratically elected government after 1994, insisted on repaying the apartheid debt. 95% of that debt was internal to South African financial companies. It wasn't external. So I think that's an important distinction. And what that means is that you have a situation within South Africa that's kind of an internal external force, if you like, that South Africans need to deal with. And this is part of the question that I also raised, that I said we haven't dealt with, which is the national question. What is a South African? What is the responsibility of the South African to the South African nation and the South African state as a whole? Once we address that question, because in general, whites in South Africa would balk at the idea that they are not part of the South African nation. But what does that mean in terms of their responsibilities to that South African nation? Unlike Israeli Jews who would, not agree in the main that they're part of the same nation as Palestinians. What does that mean? What are their responsibilities in terms of socio-economic transformation within South Africa? Is that responsibility simply to pull up a few black people into their boardrooms, or is it something broader? Those are the questions I think we need to deal with.
Thank you, Naeem. That answered and kind of brought us to another phase in the panel. But I kind of want to build a little bit and bring it back to Brahim for a second. A few of the attendees had raised this question, and I think all of the panelists have touched upon it. The use of crony capitalism and neoliberalism and globalization, quick, mindless globalization as tools of counter-revolution and as an expansion and extension of colonial legacies. And so, and also building up from Ubay's coming back to self-reliance, and your question, Naeem, also about, what is the nation, right? And Tawfiq has brought up, and I brought up kind of these divisions, national divisions. And I'm curious, what steps have been taken to kind of, also building from the attendees' questions, what steps can we take to kind of elevate and expose the role of capitalism in the anti-colonial struggle, number one. Number two, I'm very much in love with, and Andre Simon referred to Cabral, and I've been studying, as you know, Naeem, to understand the issues of Palestinian division and like a new maximal national unity. And how has South Africa, Algeria, and how can we, for the Palestinian struggle, also looking to Palestinians outside of Palestine, leverage models of self-reliance, kind of these creative localities that you talked about, Tawfiq and Ubay, as a tool for identifying and uniting the nation, what is the nation, and kind of bringing back and therefore building a mass, even if that mass is not just physically on the ground. So the first question, how have we tied the struggle against crony capitalism, neoliberalism with the anti-colonial struggle? And number two, self-reliance as a tool for unity to build a larger mass that can sustain without dependence on the foreign and the outsider. Does anybody want to take that question first? Or those questions first, either of them, or both? I'll start picking on people if not.
I can go if you...
Maybe it's that Brahim. Who do I hear?
No, if there is someone else, please.
Actually, I think that was you, Brahim. So tfaddal, please.
Okay, so I think, look, I totally hear what Ubay and Tawfiq are saying about sort of keeping the unity of national unity, but I think the national unity of the movement needs to be based not because you're Palestinian, but because you actually believe in the liberation of Palestine, and that could be done with other people. So, for me, at least with the experience of Algeria, there is this discourse of la litakhween, right? Don't call anyone a traitor, but there are traitors. There are traitors, and they need to be told that they are traitors. So, in fact, it shouldn't become a sport where there is defamation of people without sort of proof, because that would be defamation, and that should not be part of our value structure to defame people. But if there is proof of complicity with colonial powers, then that is high treason. There is we can't put sort of makeup on that stuff, and the people, it would be wrong to hide that. The people need to be aware of those dynamics. So the lines, if we can't draw the lines clearly of who the enemy is, we can't identify who the enemy is properly, we can't fight it. We need to be able to identify it and to call it we call a cat a cat. That's one thing. The second thing, when it comes to this comprador class, I think that's the comprador class is the local manifestation and the local agents of what we're talking about, this global sort of system. So I think there is hitting the global system where you are, right? Breaking its arms, local arms, is one way of countering it. So, identifying that, calling a cat, and taking them on, confronting them, head first. Zero tolerance for a sort of collaboration needs to be the strategy. So when we talk about unity, when we talk about between the people, they've been trying in Algeria. They've been trying to divide the movement between, they're trying to between sort of Amazigh or Berber-speaking Algerians and Arabic-speaking Algerians, between so-called Islamists and so-called secularists. The movement need to keep because what they are trying to do is to transform a vertical struggle between haves and have-nots, between governors and governed, into a horizontal struggle between people, between the people and the people, so they can remain as a third party and they can play the role of the judge, right? And that should not, that's where the unity ought to be sort of maintained. And the unity also, again, should not be based, in my opinion, on other things other than the value structures. We were talking earlier about sort of all these emancipatory horizons, such as Pan-Africanism, tricontinentalism, and third worldism, and so on. What do we mean by those? Those were underpinned by a value structure. By one is a consciousness of a shared condition. That's what tricontinentalism or third worldism or Pan-Africanism means. To realize that we share the same condition, whether you are in Kinshasa, whether you are in Cape Town, whether you are in Tangiers, whether you are in, wherever you are, in Asmara or whatever, the shared condition, and realizing that we have a common destiny. Either we basically together we stand, divided we fall. That's the attitude. That is the core of the solidarity, and that in some ways I'm trying to think about sort of what happened when, for example, the decolonization of Palestine became an Arab issue. There is, in some ways, that's hurtful, harmful to the cause, because it should be an anti-colonial struggle. You don't need. There are Arabs who are traitors, and there are non-Arabs who are the free of this, wherever they are around the world, who would stand to the death for the liberation of Palestine. And on those values, we should organize internally in our countries and externally and internationally.
And I think that's one of the gifts of the kind of more open and announced normalization, is it kind of removes this reduction of identity as being some sort of natural foundation for ideology. But I turn it over and just pose again. And before I do, I want to note that we are already 5 minutes past the scheduled time, but we do plan to go on for like another 20 minutes, and I'm prioritizing some of the questions. So do any of you want to answer the questions that were posed? Crony capitalism, neoliberalism as tools for counter-revolution, how to elevate them in the anti-colonial work, and self-reliance as a way to build and overcome kind of these divisions that Brahim and Tawfiq have talked about, using the diaspora and also to help build kind of a bigger mass that Ubay addressed. Do any of the other, Naim, a question came in relatedly about the inabilities or failure to expose kind of some of the comprador class that has endured in South Africa. So anybody want to step up next to answer any of these questions or address them?
If
By
I
the way,
can,
Tawfiq, you're on mute, and Ubay, you're on mute.
yeah, so let me just respond quickly on South Africa, a point here, Lemis. Despite the characterization of South Africa as being very much about black and white, I really think that we need to understand it much more complex than that. Two of the people I'm seeing in the chat, you mentioned Andre Zyman, for example, Lemis. Stephanie Kemp made a comment about traitors not being exposed in South Africa. Both of these people are stalwarts of the liberation movement. Both of them are white. Andre was in the ANC underground. Stephanie was a stalwart of the Communist Party. Both white, but both, participating here. We need to re-engage with the notion of who we are as a people. I'm talking about South Africa, but I think that this is certainly a question that Palestinians should be asking as well. Is the challenge for South Africans about black and white? Certainly it is, because in terms of socioeconomic issues, the divisions still are very much black and white. But the question really is about more than that. It's what we've inherited from the past, which is racial capitalism. And so race becomes now, particularly after 1994, a kind of way in which capitalism is served. And so we need to more correctly, as you said, Lamis, be able to identify who our enemies really are. In the South African context, certainly that is not white people. And I think that this is, increasingly will become an issue, I believe, for Palestinians to be able to talk about what is the nation that you want to work towards. If we're talking about a single Palestinian state in the future, who is part of that state? Is it just Palestinians? Something more than that? What is it?
Go ahead, Tawfiq.
I just want to sort of reflect a little bit on the Palestinian side because I think it's not very well known. Basically, Fatah identified a contradiction inside international and Israeli policy. Basically, the latter needed someone to play the self-governing role. There's actually an internal contradiction between sometimes they want one force to be able to dominate the whole of Palestinians so that one body serves the education and health and security needs. Other times, the problem with that is it creates nationalism, and that creates the basis for the national project to reignite. So inside Israeli and international policy, there's actually a contradiction going on. Fatah basically says, you guys wanted and needed somebody to play this self-governing role. You couldn't get anybody else to do it. You tried to get the Jordanians, you tried to get the Egyptians, you tried to get collaborators to do it. We will do it, and we will run the show. Okay, collaborators, not collaborators. Let's take away the sort of politics from it. They wanted to dominate the political and economic opportunities that existed there and ride it out. And from a Fatah perspective, they basically think that long-term, they will be able to contradict the Israeli strategy because as long as Palestinians remain on their land, self-organized as Palestinians, they will be able to short-circuit Zionist long-term ambitions through the demographic game. It's a brutal game. That's what they're going for. They're not looking for liberation, socialism, anything else. Just stay put. And that's all they want to do. So just stay put. They dominate the economic opportunities, and their businessmen are designed to do that. That's why the telecom company goes, a lot of the people, they get the money from there. And that's why the security services will go into you, okay? So they want to dominate those opportunities, and that's what they're doing, okay? It has its logic to it. It's not going to bring liberation. It doesn't stop colonization. It's very problematic. It's ignored Gaza, and it's ignored the diaspora. There's a million problems to it, but we need to sort of understand what's going on there. Do we have an alternative? We do, but it means we need to build it. And how relevant is this debate to folks in the West is the real question. I'll stop there.
No, I think that's right? Because there's the urgency of the need to kind of act and preempt this. There's also the reality that Fatah or the PA plays this real administrative role.
One other thing. Obey was saying something very important at the end there. He said the right-wing Israelis actually don't even want the PA, okay? Actually, what they're waiting to do next is once Abu Mazen dies, they want to actually further fragment the West Bank because they want to break down Palestinian nationalism from within, okay? They want to deal on a bilateral basis with the businessmen and the security people and the elite families. They don't want an organized, centralized project under the old PLO, even if how watered down it is, and even how messy it is right now, and even how mealy-mouthed it is under Abu Mazen, and lacks any of that revolutionary content. Abu Mazen is trying to be as counter-revolutionary as possible to avoid any kind of blowback from the Israelis. It's true. Everything he's doing is like, yes, but he's doing that because he wants to sort of keep the project alive under one centralized system that is Fatah dominated, no question about, and that their businessmen dominate. But because the next stage is the Palestinians do not have a single leader right now, and the fragmentation the Israelis have done is actually very significant. We have Gaza coming up as a whole separate project, and the West Bank might be North, South, West Bank plus what they're doing in Jerusalem. That's the danger of the Palestinian movement right now. So I'll leave it there.
So I kind of want to flip back. I see you, Ubay, and I hear you, and I think that the balance, what I was talking about, is this real administrative role that they play, right, in the provision of electricity, in the provision of support to prisoners' families, for example. All of these things that people reasonably can and should rely on. And then the counter to that is what Ubay is offering, which is building the local, these models of self-reliance. And what I'm offering is, this kind of incorporating Palestinians abroad to be an accelerant to helping really build and expand and kind of bloom it in a way that Palestinians on the ground, much smaller number, aren't able to do. And in a way that also builds a real meaningful practiced unity that answers the question of what is the Palestinian people and who returns to Palestine. I'm going to just ask a few questions, and then it's going to be however who wants to answer whatever, and then we'll close it out. I just want to add, Naeem, you made quite the face when I talked about the kind of supplanting of native knowledge and wisdom, but isn't that also a way to reverse the failures of the adoption of Western neoliberal crony capitalist policies? Is to kind of revert back and look at, especially if we're talking about self-reliant models, whether it's in Palestine or Algeria or South Africa, but look at native practices, look at native wisdom, look at native needs, look at domestic production and capacity versus looking to, as they do in Palestine or Gaza, is let's farm strawberries and ship them out. So, and this is what I was kind of getting at, is what is the role of wisdom, knowledge? And Brahim, if you could also get a moment to kind of tell us what is happening along the lines of what Naeem, Ubay, and we've discussed today. Naeem, you as well. What are the efforts tangible that are being made? People want to leave with something to take to kind of learn from and use an example. And I think, Ubay, do you want to go? You want to talk a little bit about some of these?
Yeah, I just want to make one small reference. This is something about the area Brahim talked about, because we really need to understand something. I just got out of prison. I want to say that out of the almost 5,000 prisoners today, 50% are Fatah.
Great.
You have to understand that there's a difference between the bases of Fatah. They are the most marginalized. They are the first to stand in front of the lines. They are first to pay the price of incarceration, of martyrdom, etc. And the leadership that has taken the PA with the project that Tawfiq has so brilliantly described. So when we're talking about recollecting or rebuilding the Palestinian discourse, rebuilding the Palestinian representation, it's something that we need to do from the ground up. And of course, I totally agree with what Lamis said about the role of the diaspora also. I think I heard what's his name is Abu Ghazali, who has just got this program on RT, and he talked about the figure of Palestinians on abroad being around 25 million. So most of our people abroad are abroad. If you take that figure, or if you take even the figures of the PA that are talking about 15 or 16 million Palestinians abroad, most of our people are abroad. And most of our people have also the right to return as we believe it, and we are fighting for that right. And just one last remark, because this is something that Naeem talked about. The Palestinians actually, way back in 1936, even before we were Marxists, even before we know what the left was, we had a national humanitarian, I would say, ethical solution for the Palestinian problem. Back in the revolution of 1936, we said that we wanted a free democratic nations for all of its citizens, everyone under it, no difference, no discrimination for ethnicity, for religion, etc. Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, etc. can live wholly democratic with each other. And this discourse, actually, we lost it in 1974. And with the PLO, when it came out and accepted the, what they call it, the two-state solution, or the solution, the moment or the solution based on decision 242 of Palestine, or the division of Palestine. So This discourse, I think it's much more important today to return to that discourse. The Palestinian narrative has inspired people all over the world, has inspired the Israelis and Jews, a lot of them in certain historical points were part of the Palestinian national struggle and did contribute effectively for it. And I also believe that this kind of situation can also return. I think that, for example, the most important reference, I think, of what happened in 1948 was written by a former Israeli, by Ilan Pappé. And this book, I would like also to say now that this book is the main book that is being taught today for Palestinian political prisoners by Palestinians on what happened in 1948.
That was brilliant. Thank you for that, Ubay. Brahim, would you like to interject on any of the points that were raised, or even something completely irrelevant that you'd like folks to take away? And even on the question of solidarity, I mean, even through our crises from Algeria, South Africa, and Palestine, we always see these kind of escalations of solidarity, especially at moments of crisis. On any of these topics or anything else that you'd like to add, Brahim, would you like to
Absolutely.
go or pass?
I totally agree with what Ubay just said. There is always a differentiation that needs to be made between the bases and the people who stick their necks out and their heads out for the cause, and the racketeers at the top who are willing who use the people. Always, that's always, and the conversation should never cease with the bases. You know, those are the people that's worth to actually struggle with, and they can disagree with, and they can sort of, get on your nerves, but you have to take the time to actually engage them, because they are, they are the people. They are the people. And this brings me back to what Lamis is saying about sort of the knowledge production and, local know-how and indigenous know-how. That's key. What we see sort of in Algeria, all the slogans, which are, the time and space doesn't allow us. We could have gone through some of them. The analysis that you would get in one slogan, only one slogan, you wouldn't find in any sort of academic study. And these slogans originate in the football stadium. They originate with the unemployed youth. They originate with groups of women, rural women. And they get sung one Friday, for example, when the video goes viral, and then the next Friday you have millions of Algerians chanting that same. So it's not produced in a fancy university. It's not diffused through a peer-reviewed journal, right? But it's actually the people, the downtrodden in the stadiums, in the cafes, the unemployed, women, rural communities. That's real knowledge. And the sharpness of the analysis that is expressed, but also even when they sing the slogan, they use melodies from popular songs. So it's weaved into sort of cultural referential frames and so on and so on. Maybe I'll leave this to another time, and maybe I can just focus on this, because I personally am fascinated, and I get goosebumps when I see those. But I want to say something, return very, very quickly to today. Again, it's the 66th anniversary of the start of the Algerian War for Liberation. Today, as we speak, Algeria and that date, the symbolism of that date is being desecrated by the military oligarchy. They are trying to pass a colonial constitution, a constitution that is imposed by the US, by France. They're changing the constitution to allow the Algerian military to be deployed abroad. And that's the price. This military comprador military oligarchy, They had denationalized in the 90s. They had denationalized national resources. In the 2000s, they have that's the price for getting Western support for their rule. They denationalized the economy, and today they are denationalizing the Algerian military. So in a few weeks, you'll probably hear about Algerian military being deployed in Mali or in Burkina Faso or in Niger under so-called peace missions. So the Algerian Liberation Army that was liberating Africa in the 50s and contributing to the liberation of the world, today on the anniversary of the revolution is being used to become a stick in the hands of colonial powers to dispossess and to oppress other Africans. Then the movement today, again, Algerians have been protesting. Dozens of arrests have been made, protesting across the globe, in Canada, in Western Europe, inside the country, to actually bring down these elections, and no media coverage whatsoever. I'll remind you, 18 months of revolutionary movement in Algeria, where millions, one of the Fridays, according to official figures, 20 million Algerians were on the street in a country of 37 million. 60% of the population was on the streets. Until today, not a single country has made an official statement to condemn the repression. Not a single country. So not to say that the Algerians are waiting for anyone to help them. No. Algerians wear it as a badge of honor, and they will bring down the forces of hubris, the forces of arrogance, but it's just, a call for history to record that not a single statement has been made.
And this brings up, Ibrahim, and maybe you'll close out and take a minute to consider, but really brings up, as, for example, the South African struggle kind of comes and resurfaces on occasion back into mainstream media, and as Palestine always is what role can we play from inside Palestine and outside Palestine as we're organizing to support and kind of elevate the struggle in Algeria? Does anybody, Naeem, would you like to add before we wrap up in a few minutes?
Sure. So a couple of points quickly, Lamis. First, let me just say to add to what Brahim said about the Algerian military. It was 3 weeks ago, I think, Brahim, that U.S. destroyer docked in Algiers as part of a collaboration between the Algerian military and AFRICOM. And we know the role of AFRICOM on the African continent right now. Let me see if I did make a face earlier. It wasn't at anything you said. It was probably at my cat. So forgive that. But on that issue that I supposedly made a face about. No, I firmly
innocent, not guilty. No worries.
I firmly believe that indigenous knowledge and indigenous solutions are certainly required. To use Ubey's comment earlier, before we were Marxists, we were able to find solutions to our problems. Anwar Majid has this book, Unveiling Traditions. It's maybe about 15 years old now, where he speaks about that in order to defeat capitalism in whichever society you live in, the way to do it is not to import solutions, but to dig deep into our own traditions, to find the solutions that will strengthen us and help to defeat that. And I think that is extremely important, and certainly we need to do that. And I think that brings me to my last point, which is the issue that Brahim raised as well about solidarity. Certainly the era of the anti-colonial struggles of the past, independent struggles of the past, is past, where we had these great alliances forming that led thereafter to the non-aligned movement, etc. Many of the liberation movements that came out of that era now are collaborators with the US, with whichever other power, etc. But what we do require, apart from those political parties and governments, is a renewal of a kind of global South solidarity. If we want to liberate Palestine, it's not going to happen because we rely on Arabs. To echo what I think Brahim said, it will happen if we are able to build a global South solidarity where people in the South, whether it's South Africa or Brazil or wherever else, are able to claim Palestine as their own cause. Not in this kind of northern solidarity where, we'll help you, we'll give you aid and we'll set up some NGOs, but where your pain is our pain and ours is yours. Solidarity goes both ways too. And I think that really is the future in how Palestine will be liberated. Clearly, Arab governments have shown that if we rely on them, we will all be stabbed in the back.
I'm going to turn it over to Ubay, maybe 30 seconds, closing remarks. Tawfiq, if you want to add anything, and close out with Brahim and end the day. Ubay, would you like to add anything?
Oh, yes. I think that the need for South-South solidarity, South-South coordination, South-South work is higher today than any time else in history. I truly believe in the works of Samir Amin, what he did with the works for discussing international imperialism, and the Palestinian cause, I think, relies in the heart of that. We are also in solidarity with the people's movements, with the people being oppressed everywhere around the world, in the US, with people, the black people that are being subjugated and killed on the streets every day. We are following up on that, with the people of South Africa and the problems that they are facing. And of course, with the struggles of the Arabs in their countries, like in Algeria, trying to take back their revolution and their country. And one last thing is that we are the many, we are the masses. We have the future. It's either socialism, liberation, or it's barbarism. And this is the way forward. So thank you for everyone. And in solidarity, hasta la victoria siempre, everyone.
Thank you, Ubay. That was fantastic. Tawfiq, closing remarks.
Sure. Yeah, just a couple of things. In as much as, I think indigenous communities and solutions have a lot to offer, I think we need to be careful and certainly understand the Palestinian context very carefully. Palestine is an economy that is de-developed. It is entirely under lockdown. In as much as it's important for local communities to feed themselves, etc., at a certain point, you can't produce too much because there's no market for it. You can't even take it to the next town so there will be grave limitations to that, and people need to realize that. Yes. When it comes to the question of solidarity, I hope nobody ever interpreted any of my remarks as saying that it's the Arabs that are going to liberate Palestine or anything like that. I wanted to certainly paint a picture that we all have a role, because very much Palestine incorporates so many of these dimensions that we've talked about today. And global South-South solidarity is going to have a really important role in that. I would say we need to actually identify that, because there is this major retreat happening, in particular in places like India, where you have, India used to be like brother movement with the Palestinians, both victims of partition and British colonialism, and you name it. And today they are ideologues of Zionism and Hindutva nationalism. So we need to stem the retreat that's happening in the global South for Palestine and what's happening there. And then there is a particular role for the Arab world, but obviously that's a huge kettle of fish I can't get into. But for those people in the audience who are in the West, you are very much so in the belly of the beast. You are in the main influential decision makers who are actually positioned right now. And for that reason, that's why in my talk, I was trying to emphasize the need to really Palestine solidarity activism is wide. It incorporates everyone from pacifists to Islamists to leftists to anarchists to that's healthy. That's good. We need that diversity, but we also need things that we can unite on. And the things that we can unite upon, it's up to you guys to decide. But the architecture of Zionist power and what promotes Zionism in each locale is going to be different. You need to study that. You need to find the clear targets, the lowest hanging fruit that you can make the strongest arguments, and also study what happens in Palestine to find opportunities to raise it and then help whatever happens in Palestine. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And maybe this will be the first in a series that really kind of parses through these issues, that gives you a little bit more time, but helps all of us identify what are like key, pivotal, small steps that can have massive gains. And there's a lot that's brewing all over. I'm sure you've read and seen from the proposals, and that is taken from here along with work that's happening. So just a note before you close out, Brahim, for folks who are interested in continuing this conversation, more advanced, more detailed, we'll also be incorporating and looking at Bolivia, looking at Guatemala, what's happened there successfully or otherwise. If you're interested, make sure that you send us a note letting us know, and we'll keep you apprised. And Brahim, closing remarks.
No, I just want to echo what turn
off your camera.
I just want to echo what my comrades were saying, that, and especially what Naim has said, that the decolonization of Palestine, it's not something being in solidarity to sound cool or to sound to sound sort of worldly. But at the same time, being acquiesced to injustice where you are is really hot air, to be honest. So unless people realize that they are not free, as long as there are unfree people on this world, then it doesn't emanate from the right place. So for you to actually truly be free, you can't live in a world in which Palestine is still colonized and you think you're free, because it's just not possible. That's not possible. So it needs to be, solidarity needs to be based on that kind of understanding, a shared condition and a shared or a common destiny. The last word I want to say about sort of what we can do practically also, I think you're already doing it, because a lot of internationalists that I know, we do, and I'm guilty of it too, we don't talk enough. We don't talk to each other enough. We say that this is what needs to, the normative, we say that we need to be talking to one another and learning from one another, but we don't do it enough. So I really, I'm not saying this sort of as out of protocol, but I really sort of take my hat off for you, Lemis, for Suzanne, for Charlotte, for all the work that you're doing and for putting this together. This is what solidarity looks like. This is what solidarity looks like.
Thank you, Brahim. And on that note, I bring back to what you started with, which is the precedential value of what's happening in Palestine is a real material direct threat to the people in Algeria and South Africa and Venezuela and globally. We look forward to hearing more from you. We'll talk about the next steps and the next webinar that we'll have, also some conversations with the attendees. Again, my thanks to all of the panelists, to the attendees, Suzanne and Charlotte, for all of your work, and Michael Letwin, who left us earlier. And on that, bye, everybody. Thank you again. Onward and upward, inshallah.